Thank you for tuning in to the Scholar Spotlight. Please be sure to let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. My name is Brad Fulton, and I serve as the director of the Faith and Prejudice Institute, which is part of the larger Faith and Prejudice movement. Our mission is to convene, equip, and mobilize churches to build bridges to racial equity. At the Institute, we focus on curating and disseminating research on race and religion. Our aim is to cultivate an informed and inspired public on this topic. As part of our Scholar Spotlight series today, we're interviewing Professor Eric McDaniel. Dr. McDaniel earned his PhD in political science from the University of Illinois, and he did his undergrad work at Wilberforce University. He is currently a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and he co-directs the Politics of Race and Ethnicity Lab. The first book he wrote is entitled Politics in the Pews, The Political Mobilization of Black Churches. Today, we'll be discussing his newest book, The Everyday Crusade, Religious Nationalism in American Politics. Thank you, Professor McDaniel, for joining us.
Thank you, Professor Fulton. I'm glad to be here with you.
So I'm super excited to talk about your book. But before we do, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became a professor who studies religion and politics?
I'm originally from the St. Louis area. I was born in Alton, and lived in St. Louis and around that area until I was about 13 when I went to high school in Northern Virginia. But when I was in the St. Louis area, I went to St. Paul AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church. So my father is an AME minister. My parents got divorced. We moved to St. Louis. We went to the St. Paul AME Church, which has the history of being the oldest AME church west of the Mississippi. The first black man selected to serve in the Senate actually pastored St. Paul at one point before going down to Mississippi after Reconstruction, and then being selected to the Senate. And the church that I was there at, the pastor was the late Bishop C. Garnett Henning, and he. At the time, I didn't realize this in an atmosphere of a church that was very politically engaged, and that atmosphere. Jesse Jackson came to speak, Farrakhan came to speak, a bunch of different things had gone on. And I'm actually catching, at that time, Reverend Henning, I'm catching him as he's kind of curtailing a lot of his street level activism. Again, before, he had pastored another church in St. Louis where he wore a dashiki in the pulpit. Before that, when then he was in L.A., he was an activist, was on a variety of city council boards, things like that, and worked for state agencies, and then comes back to St. Louis and is really doing a lot of the same stuff. I leave there. I go to high school in Northern Virginia, and I think what I was learning in St. Louis all of a sudden came to fruition while I was in high school, where I began to really start thinking about these things. And also it's the early 90s, so you have Public Enemy, you have Do the Right Thing coming out, so you have all of these the stuff going on. I became really interested in really political activism. Decided to go to Wilberforce, which is an AME school, so it's the oldest private historically black college. And the reason I went there is because Bishop Henning went there. He was my, basically, I want to emulate him in so many ways. They didn't have a history major. They had a political science major. I got into that. I didn't really think about going into academia, and it kind of fell into my lap. And ended up going to the University of Illinois because it was a PhD program. I was going to do an MPA program, but they weren't paying. The PhD program said, "We'll go pay for it." Like, oh, cool, I'll try that out. And it was really a lot of. I knew what I did want to do. I did want to be a lawyer. But I kind of fell into this.
Wow!
And it was my first semester. I was in Todd Shaw's, who would eventually end up being on my committee. I was in his interest groups and collective action course, and I started thinking about, why aren't churches as politically engaged as we're talking about the civil rights movement? And I was thinking, like, why aren't churches as politically engaged? And something popped in my head. I was like, wait a second. The church I went to in St. Louis was different than all the other churches. And so so raise the question, okay, so why do some churches choose to be active? Why do some not? And so if you think of the church as being so politically active, the black church being so politically active, why do some churches choose not to? But if you think of churches in general as being institutions that support the status quo or being apolitical institutions, why do some choose to be politically engaged? And that drove me down this pathway. So that's why my first book is along those lines.
Yeah.
And since then, like, it keeps driving me because I grew up in the church. My mom was one of the first people there, last people to leave. So I tell my when I talk about the church, look, unlike what I was told as a child, churches are voluntary organizations. You don't have to go. But I was there all the time, and so I was in this institution my entire life, and I began to see like how much it shaped the way I think about the world, the way I do things, and I started thinking like, well, thinking about it from the organizational standpoint, and also from the behavioral standpoint. How does religion influence our politics? How does religion influence the way we see ourselves and the expectations we have on ourselves and of the world?
I mean, this is very fascinating, because it sounds like almost retrospectively, as you look back on your upbringing in your life, you were living, in many ways, the research that you're now doing, especially the intersection of politics and congregations. And it provides really good context for your current book. And I'm actually very interested to know what motivated you to pivot to the book, The Everyday Crusade, and to write that particular book.
So I laugh about this project because this project started before the Obama administration. So that's how old it is. And I was talking to one of my co-authors, Irfan Narudin. So I knew him from grad school. He was at Michigan. I was at the University of Illinois. And we were working on this project looking at patriotism and nationalism and trying to understand, okay, when we think of patriotism as being this kind of pure, kind of a very loving type of national identity, and nationalism as this kind of very dark, egocentric way of national attachment. Like, are they really as distinct as you make them out to be? And sometimes can patriots look like nationalists? But then we also began talking about the idea of linking religion and patriotism. And because, again, the idea of going into a church and in the pulpit, you'll see an American flag. If you think of religion as being universal, but having no national boundaries, why do you have the nation's flag in the pulpit? And, the idea of concept is the same as of God and country. And also, I think a lot of this was coming off of the tail end of the Bush administration, where there was a lot of rhetoric, where I do think President Bush tried to push back on this a bit. But there was a lot of rhetoric within the people, amongst his supporters, of, this is a holy war. So like, you had one person say they attack us because we're Christians. And then you have the issue where on the gun sites, they put scripture passages on there, like, so the idea of seeing this as a holy war. It's not just in this idea of thinking about Christian nationalism, of this idea where patriotism and piety become the same. And we started working on that. Allison Shortle, who at the time was a grad student at Ohio State, where Irfan was, she joined the project and added a great deal more energy to it. And as time went along, we kind of kept collecting data, saying, okay, we'll have this done in a year. Fast forward 2 years. Okay, we'll have it done in a year. And then all of a sudden, we were able to sit down, focus, and get it all done.
Well, and actually, the timing of your publication, it couldn't have been better in terms of, I mean, a day does not go by without hearing about Christian nationalism. And actually, I'm wondering, can you, for us, just define Christian nationalism? Like, what does it mean?
So the book title says, Christian nationalism, but in the book we refer to it as American religious exceptionalism. But the issue is they're really not that separate. They're really a little bit difficult to separate. And the reason I didn't want to call it Christian nationalism, because I know it can be a loaded term, and so I didn't want it to be a term that could be that people would hear it and then think it means something else. But at its heart, when I think of Christian nationalism, and also the way I think of American religious exceptionalism, not so much you think, oh, okay, this is a nation that's predominantly Christian, but it's deeper than that. It's not an issue of who the people are, but why the nation was founded and what the purpose of the nation is. And what we talk about with American religious exceptionalism is this belief that the nation was founded for a divine purpose and has divine favor. So the U.S., God created the U.S. It is God's favorite, and it is the U.S.'s job to carry out God's divine mission. And when you think of Christian nationalism, there's one standpoint that says, okay, the nation was created by Christians. But there's another which says, no, the nation should be dominated and controlled by Christians because we have a mission, we have a Christian mission to accomplish, and through this, and it's only through having Christian leadership that we can accomplish this goal. And a lot of the rhetoric we're seeing right now around this is about Christians should be in charge, Christians should dictate everything that goes forward. Uh, but the problem we have is, okay, well, which Christians? And that's the thing I don't think they really want to answer. And that's where we run into major problems.
Sure. So on one level, it's part of the origin story of the United States that it was founded by predominantly people who were Christians. And then there's a second layer, which is, well, in order to fulfill the mission of this country, we need to maintain a certain group of Christians being in leadership of this nation. Is kind of the idea.
Yeah, that's it exactly. Yeah.
And so then probably why is Christian nationalism then so strongly linked with white evangelicals? Because kind of maybe what you said is that, okay, it's not just tied to Christians, but a specific type of Christianity. So why is Christian nationalism linked so closely with white evangelicals?
I think one of the main reasons why I think is because this is a group that has, if you think about the early aspects where you think of kind of our Christian nationalism or the idea of the nation being the being godly or godly ordained, you can think about the Puritans coming in and the idea of the city upon a hill. And that is kind of the narrative that took over. But evangelicals have really taken on this idea of the U.S. being a special nation. And you can think about this with the kind of Second Great Awakening, where evangelicals kind of took off and really tried to get people more involved in church, but started spreading this message of, we are a Christian nation as a way to get people in, because many Americans were on church at that time. Then you can think about the fights amongst evangelicals over slavery. And then the attempt for reconciliation post-Civil War was this idea of, look, we are God's nation. We survived this. And because we survived this is proof we're God's nation and that we should carry on. And you see that happen, with, Manifest Destiny and the attempts to move out. It's like, no, we are special. This is why we can go into Cuba. This is why we can go into the Philippines. This is why we can do these things, because we're carrying out God's mission. And it became even more so when you move into the Cold War, where certain evangelicals who were seen as on the fringes now become mainstream. So Billy Graham being a perfect example of that, where these individuals were kind of seen as, there's something going on with them. But because they were so gung-ho about the nation and the fight against the godless communists, that they went from the fringes to the mainstream. And from there, they have kind of held on to their spot of being, of really dictating what it means to be a Christian, but also what it means to be an American. And it's something that's evolved over time. And I think this might be seen as the pinnacle of it, of where they've been able to kind of fully demonstrate this. So they've been able to demonstrate it in the past, but they kind of been pushed back. And there are a lot of books which have talked about white evangelicals kind of being trapped in the Republican Party, much like blacks are trapped in the Democratic Party. But this idea that they've actually been able to dictate the agenda a little bit more, been able to find some victories at the state level, and then be able to carry that out at the national level.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summary of sort of the historical trajectory. If you think of, well, like, how can Christian nationalism ideology be harmful to churches? So how is this going to infect or harm churches, this ideology?
I think the big problem with that ideology is that it hurts the authenticity. If you think of religion as being something that is not by national boundaries, as something that supersedes nation. That if you argue that your religion is the nation, that it becomes heretical in many ways.
Hmm.
And but the idea of marrying religion and nationalism makes sense because many scholars of nationalism argue that no, nationalism will take the place of religion. Instead
Hmm.
of people worshiping um, a superpower deity, they'll now worship the nation. And Christian nationalism is seen to be using Christianity as a way to justify the worship of the nation, and so it becomes off looking idolatrous. But on top of that, it also creates a very stark contrast about who is really part of the nation and who is not. And so, in
Hmm.
doing so,
Hmm.
you will discriminate and oppress groups because you'd be like, well, they're undeserving.
Hmm.
And the reason they're undeserving is because of some idea of ethics or things like that. It's just because they don't identify as Christians. And for the U.S., the reason why it's so damaging is the U.S. has always defined itself as being the first new nation, being built upon values or shared principles, not on shared faith. And if we move to this idea that to truly be American, you have to have this shared faith, we are now violating the principles that were critical to the nation's founding.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in regards to religious freedom and the free exercise of religion, any religion, in a sense. So then, what do you see as an appropriate way for Christians to view their role in American society? If it's not Christian nationalism and that ideology, what would you propose as the appropriate way for Christians to view their role in society?
I'm glad you asked that question because what commonly happens is when I make these statements, everybody is like, "Oh, okay." I get a lot of the kind of humanist groups or atheist groups saying, "Yeah, we need to get rid of religion altogether." I'm like, "No, no, 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 no. I'm not saying get rid of religion. I'm a religious person myself." I do think that one thing that Christians need to be able to do is, they say, don't um, hide your light under a bushel, or don't hide your light. We need to come out. We need to speak out more.
Hmm.
There needs to be much more of a kind of a reclaiming it.
Hmm.
And I think there's a significant number of Christians who are like, no, I don't like this idea at all. But they're not heard. They are ignored. Um,
Hmm.
and part of this is because they don't have as much control over kind of mass media,
Hmm.
like many others do. You think of the vast media empires that people like Pat Roberts built, like with the 700 Club and everything else like that. They're not able to get their message out. But I do think that there has to be kind of a sit down. Let's actually have a real conversation about this. And this is difficult because this means that people are going to have to try to basically reconcile. Okay, here's what I think my religion actually says, but here's what I think it says, but here's what it actually says. And think about the fact that you know, yes, I can see my nation as taking part in a divine cause, and and it's important because that gets people to a sacrifice to do things they normally would not do. But they also have to understand that look, my nation can also fall short. Uh, that's why I would recommend people read the work of people like Ronald Niebuhr, who, he he basically made it clear, like, look, I'm supporting the U.S. in the fight against communism, and I see what they're doing, but I also understand that they're not pure, and I'm doing it because it's the lesser of two evils.
Hmm.
And I think the problem is a lot of people, instead of saying this is the lesser of two evils, in order to reconcile this, they'll say like, no, 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 they're purely evil, we're good. And
Hmm.
sometimes it's not a fight between good and evil. It's really a fight between between really bad and not as bad. Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
but in order for us to feel good about ourselves, we can't be not as bad. We have to be good.
Hmm.
And a
Hmm.
lot of it is really getting people to deal with their identities and deal with the complexity of their identities. Understand the good, the bad, and the ugly of who they are. And I think for Christians to really do this is going to have to create a lot of introspection, something
Hmm.
that I'm not sure if they're willing to do, because a lot of leadership doesn't want to do this because the leadership does this, it'll upset the members. If the members are upset, the members will leave. And this is why you see a lot of churches not getting active in social and certain social causes because they're like, look, our job is to keep the doors open first, then we can do everything
Hmm.
else.
Sure. I mean, what I hear you saying, or the words that come to mind, is the posture of Christians in American society is one of prophetic humility, in the sense that there's a prophetic voice, but it's made with great humility of recognizing their place in the world. Would that resonate? Do you think, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is critical. There are a lot of people who I've talked to who said, "Yeah, we have all these resources. I think God has blessed us with these resources, but because God has blessed us with these resources, means we need to tread carefully with where we go. That we need to work with other nations. We need to work with others. Whereas others like, yeah, so we can just run down the hill and just force everything. But I do think that humility aspect is critical, and I think the lack of humility is where you see
Mm-hmm.
Christian nationalism take off, um, as opposed to um, I don't want to say Christian patriotism because that's loaded as well, but more of a Christian national attachment. I think that would be more of a, hey, this is who we are. I'm proud to be an American. I'm proud of who I am. I do believe that there are some Christian goals our nation can take out, can carry out, and should carry out. But I also
Mm-hmm.
believe that we need to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that we do this in terms of a brotherhood with other nations, as opposed to a hierarchy against other nations.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think it's valid to have pride in one's country, especially the United States, with all the freedoms, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. We can have great pride in those aspects of our country, but then also recognizing there's some parts that we've gone astray, and it's not beneficial. So here's a tricky question. Like, what are some ways that Christians can respond to people who hold strong Christian nationalist views? So, like, if you're a person in your church and someone else in your church has very strong Christian nationalist views, what would you recommend as a way to respond to that person?
That is a great question. I think of people have talked about nationalism being equivalent to religious fundamentalism, and this is basically nationalism and religious fundamentalism coming together.
Mm-hmm.
And these individuals, because they have these very strong held beliefs, they are great for getting things done. Not necessarily getting things done right, but getting things done. Um, but the problem you run into is, okay, but when they're doing these things, getting them to be aware of the fact that, look, you are causing harm. I think one of the ways is really, I've been thinking about this quite a bit. I think a lot of times it's kind of just walking them through it, have them walk through the logic of this,
Hmm.
and they would sit down, let's walk through the logic. And the more judgmental you are towards them, the more they're going to dig in deeper because they
Mm-hmm.
already feel like they're being persecuted. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you do persecute, they feel that gives them even more evidence to believe that they're persecuted. And so you're kind of you're fulfilling what they're already thinking, and so you're not able to make any progress doing that. But I think
Mm-hmm.
would have to be conversations, and like for instance, like the big fight against critical race theory would
Mm-hmm.
be, okay. Look, this is what happened. Why should we not talk about it?
Mm-hmm.
What is
Mm-hmm.
the harm in talking about it? And a lot of times, I think it requires these individuals kind of sit down and do self introspection. And that's why I think actually sitting there asking questions would probably be the best way to do this. But the problem is that takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And, sometimes you get worn out. And the problem is, I think people want the quick fix. And it's like, if this did not happen overnight, it's not going to be solved overnight.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times concepts get thrown out there, or people throw them out there without thinking through, like, well, what do they actually mean, or what are their origins? And I really appreciate what you said of, like, rather than me telling a person what Christian nationalism is, I could just inquire to them of, so help me understand, like, what are your beliefs or views around this topic, and what are their origins, and letting that person sort of explain and almost do the work of explaining it and understanding it, and it might then reveal some of the flaws or fallacies with that type of thinking. I mean, I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, and again, because this thing, and you have to be careful because this it's so closely linked to someone's identity that you want to basically, uh, while getting them to kind of realize, okay, there's some problems here. All of a sudden, have a basically have a crisis of consciousness and have themselves unravel personally as well. So it's
Hmm.
this weird thing about this. So if you come at them, with a sledgehammer, it doesn't work. They're just going to get more intense. But you want to kind of slowly walk them down that path. And so they think it's their idea. One thing people
Hmm.
always told me is I only want to do something if I think it's my idea. And I think that's what a lot of people are like. It's like if you make them think it's their idea, they'll get there. Um,
Hmm.
and you have to be
Hmm.
very careful about how you do it because this is their identity. This is how they've come to understand themselves. And we can see a crisis of identity going on within the U.S. right now, and how this is kind of tearing the nation apart. Just think about a crisis of identity for an individual and how it tears them apart.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah. If the person becomes defensive, it'll shut down the conversation, and you won't have an opportunity
Yeah,
for going down that path. Like I said earlier, I don't think a day goes by without hearing the term Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism, and in many ways, this conversation is very helpful of sort of expanding our understanding of Christian nationalism and how it relates to the church. And so I really appreciate you, Professor McDaniel, joining us and really for all the research that you're doing on this topic. It's very helpful. Um, and I also want to thank everyone else who joined us. If you want to learn more about Professor McDaniels and his research on religion and politics, I encourage you to check out his website below. And also, I encourage you to order his book, The Everyday Crusade. And again, we'll have a link for where you can order that book. But really, Professor McDaniel, thank you again so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we hope you have a great day.